The Marvel Cinematic Universe is a monolith. Despite its dominance in pop culture, however, it's never had a strong footing in gaming. While Marvel itself continues to have unique, exciting, and occasionally controversial titles, the MCU hasn't had a tie-in game since the first Captain America. This is the story of how that came to be, why we no longer get Marvel tie-in games, and how one studio attempted to innovate in a market swamped with the same old superhero formula. This is the story of the Avengers from THQ, the last MCU game. In 2009 at the THQ Australia Christmas party, word started to get around that the studio had secured the license to the Avengers. Sega, who currently held the rights to the newly formed Marvel Cinematic Universe's games, had a deal that was set to end after their tie-in Captain America Super Soldier. And with THQ's newly formed relationship with the comic company after their Superhero Squad game, it was becoming clear that they were the intended successor. Their game, while not a straight adaptation or even in the rapidly growing MCU, was intended to release at the same time as the upcoming movie in 2012, and occupy the same space that games like Iron Man and The Incredible Hulk had before. The key here was extra time for development. Sega's outings, which hadn't been particularly well received, had all been developed in less than 2 years apiece, and it clearly showed with their lackluster copies of Radical's Ultimate Destruction or downright messy tie-ins with Iron Man. If Marvel wanted to continue their legacy of iconic tie-in games in this new era, giving a developer nearly 3 years was the right solution. THQ Studio Australia, nicknamed Studio Oz, were skeptical, however. The Avengers was an unknown quantity to most people, and details on the upcoming film were more than a little scarce. Not only was the director still unannounced, but the MCU was still almost 5 months out from Chris Evans being cast as Captain America. When one designer would ask what comics he should read in preparation, no one at THQ could really give him a straight answer. One answer, however, came in the form of Brian Michael Bendis, who alongside Mark Millar had been working as a consulting producer for the upcoming film, and would pen a story for Studio Oz involving the shape-shifting Skrulls. At that time, Bendis was most known for his work on the comic event Secret Invasion, and while this Skrull invasion was much less subtle, it would feature similar characters such as the Skrull Queen Veranke and a variety of iconic locations based on the greater Marvel universe. Similar to the Secret Invasion stories, however, it would feature some trademark deception, with the team being betrayed by S.H.I.E.L.D. operative and resident Spider-Woman Jessica Drew, who was secretly the Skrull Queen in disguise. Also early on in development, the in-game team wasn't the ironclad, pun intended, group we would see in the film, going as far as to go beyond just the main players like Cap, Iron Man, Hulk, and Thor, and expanded to secondary up-and-coming heroes like Hawkeye and Black Widow, and even ones that weren't going to be in the film at all, such as Vision and Carol Danvers as Ms. Marvel. Secret Invasion as the influence of a game like this wasn't unheard of, as just a year prior, Marvel Ultimate Alliance 2 had been a loose retelling of the singular Secret War, and its follow-up Civil War, the former of which being written by Bendis in 2005. Being the next Avengers-focused event in the comics, it was the natural choice, as it would appeal to die-hard comic fans, but also didn't involve explaining the Illuminati and Planet Hulk to people who thought Hawkeye was from MASH before the movie came out. Starting out, Studio Oz had a strong idea of what kind of game they wanted to make. In the previous August, the door to comic book video games had been blown wide open with Arkham Asylum, with its freeform combat and a strong commitment to making you feel like you know who. When approaching their own take on not one but a team of heroes, third-person action seemed to be the only way to go. Very little footage of the game in third person exists, but what is out there showcases something that's clear with its inspirations, with heavy-hitting combos and acrobatic finishes. It's a game that, had it been released in this form, would likely be remembered fondly, but not for shaking up the genre. The most accurate analogy I can think of is something like the first Avenger tie-in game Super Soldier, which despite Sega's shortcoming with Marvel, is a good not great Arkham clone in an era rapidly filling with them. While this would have been one of the first of its kind and had enough time to be polished into something great, it lacks a certain innovation, or even a commitment to the team-up nature of the Avengers, and it wouldn't be long until the studio would begin to realize this. But what they also came to realize was that THQ wasn't on the surest of footings, as after 6 months of work on Avengers, Studio Oz would receive a massive shakeup, outing studio head Steve Middleton and adding a new lead designer, Christian Daly. Daly, upon examining the project, would recognize how similar it was to all the other superhero and movie tie-in games out there. Third person felt a bit stale, and Daly persuaded the team to instead take it into the first. It was an immediate, abrupt shift that made it unlike any of their direct competitors. It also shifted the entirety of the focus by taking inspiration from games like Left 4 Dead and allowing players to team up with their friends or AI in multiplayer missions. This wasn't without its challenges, however. While Iron Man shot lasers and Thor bolts of lightning and hammers, characters like Hulk and Captain America didn't lend themselves super well to the range combat first-person games were known for. Having one brawler on the team was probably okay, but a second one felt a little like cheating. The team had a problem, and his name was Captain America. Their first idea was to give him a gun. This was, after all, an FPS, and Cap wasn't far off from any other war hero featured in military shooters. Marvel, however, wasn't a fan. While he would go on to use a gun very sparingly in the first Avenger, his use of one in the modern day is all but non-existent, instead relying on throwing his shield, which would have been a little slow as his main gimmick, and doing flying kicks into people's heads. While interviews don't really include a straightforward answer from developers, leaked footage shows Cap in a sort of support role, with a main moveset focused on punching and throwing his shield, but the bulk of his duties in-game involving special moves focused on healing and enemy defense debuffs. It's a unique solution that really benefits from the new perspective and falls in line with the proto-hero shooter that was on the rise at that time. Captain America's moveset and the added focus on multiplayer would push the development team into a new direction, as they implemented more cooperative elements between players. One could stun an enemy as another would move in to do a finisher, or they could work together to combine their powers into longer chains and help clear the field. It's a direct influence from games like Left 4 Dead and even the first Borderlands, taken to the next level. It also reminds me most of Ultimate Alliance 2, done in a more naturally feeling way, with its finishers focused on combining two heroes together in what they call fusion moves. While the gameplay wasn't necessarily as in-depth as what could have been done in third person, what was there was impressive, with enough variety and objectives to not get stale, and a simplicity in controls to make it easier to pick up and play with larger groups, or try out new characters. It was also occupying its own niche within THQ, who at that time mainly had games either targeted very young, like their disastrous U-Draw tablet or the aforementioned Superhero Squad, or very mature, like Saints Row and Red Faction. It was a nice middle ground, and while the project was always slightly behind, it continued to impress not only THQ higher-ups, but even Marvel themselves. What was also impressive, however, was just how fast things were crumbling underneath THQ. With the large install base of the PS2, they had no trouble putting all of their eggs in the licensed game basket, paying high dollar for the rights to develop massive franchises like Nickelodeon, while taking out sketchy loans whose repayment were planned based on the acquisition of more and more licenses. When development was split between console generations, and most importantly, licensed games started moving mobile, things were no longer sustainable. THQ gambled on every PS2 and Xbox owner rushing out to get a 360, pushing the bulk of their development to the next generation. This meant that they were in far too deep when the market bottomed out. That, on top of developing unsuccessful original IP like Red Faction, and an executive team that refused to turn the ship before their bow was firmly inside the iceberg, it was clear that cutbacks were going to be necessary. And with the Australian dollar greatly inflated in the wake of the recession, the biggest cuts would be at the door of the Avengers project. In August of 2011, THQ would begin their restructuring efforts, cutting 3 studios: THQ Phoenix of MX vs. ATV fame, Blue Tongue Studios of De Blob, who had been acting as a support studio on Avengers, and of course, Studio Oz, laying off 200 people in total. Many at the studio saw it coming. The project, despite its quality, had been very expensive. Sales estimates weren't in line with what it needed to break even. But that didn't stop developers from being very fond of the project, admiring its simplicity, and wishing that it had come out despite everything. When developers working on Avengers got word, however, they would begin making assets to show to Marvel Entertainment in an attempt to encourage them to save the project. Despite having just over 9 months before the release of the film and a solid foundation, Marvel would pass on the project. Those assets would be shown off to Kotaku Australia and posted to YouTube anonymously, giving fans a glimpse at what could have been. When the film would release, its biggest tie-in games would be the Avengers the mobile game, an iPhone title developed by Gameloft. In March of 2012, Disney executive THQ Jefferson would mention that the Avengers were bigger than just one game, and that fans could expect announcements in the coming weeks. Only a few days after the release of the film, Ubisoft would announce that they were working on their own Avengers game, this time for the Kinect, that would release in October. While it would maintain the Skrull invasion plotline, it was more than anything a reskin of their game Power Up Heroes, and wouldn't have any assets from Studio Oz's project, or any input from Brian Michael Bendis. Going forward, Marvel would no longer have console tie-ins to the MCU, instead relying more heavily on standalone titles in their own universes, like Marvel's Spider-Man, or one of two Guardians of the Galaxy games. Their closest direct tie-in would come in the form of LEGO Marvel Avengers, a Lego-ified retelling of the first two Avengers film, and pieces of Phase 2. It's unlikely that the Avengers project would have been the next Arkham. Even in its developers' own words, it was a simple game, but it's still a shame that it doesn't exist. It feels in line with the Ultimate Alliance games, a reminder of a time when Marvel was on the cusp of exploding, where they could still experiment, rather than having to create overbloated AAA titles that appeal to everyone a little bit, and barely anyone more than that. It also would be a reminder of the end of movie tie-ins, when original titles were becoming more and more the norm. We'll definitely see another Avengers game, or at the very least featuring these characters together in some form. But whatever that game is, it won't look anything like this.